right, so we have arrived at the capitalization of interest, which is one of the more awful parts of the chapter, but I think we can get through this. We're dealing with self-constructed assets. We already talked about overhead. Now we're talking about the interest costs associated with building something. You can read over the notes for more explanation on sort of the various ways to look at it. Basically, FASB says we should capitalize certain interest costs associated with qualifying assets under construction. Okay, so what are qualifying assets? A company has to be building something for its own use. Okay, let's look at qualifying assets here. Or rather, it can be a discrete project that is for sale or lease to a customer. So a real estate development is a good example where the interest costs are capitalized all during the construction process, doing the road work and everything, and then once they start to sell, they're expensed along with the, as part of the cost of goods sold. So, so those would be, but the main ones we'll be looking at are assets, built for a company's own use. Not qualifying, routinely manufactured inventories, and assets that are already at their intended purpose. Okay, so that's important to know. So we have to know, does it qualify? For most of your homework, it's going to qualify because they're giving you the problem to do, so we don't have to worry about that one too much. We have to know the capitalization period. Okay, so you can't capitalize interest before you start the project. You can't capitalize interest once the project is done, once the building is ready for its intended use, or when you have stopped incurring interest costs. So that second one is important. So the capitalization period, it begins at the first expenditure and it ends when the asset is substantially complete or when the interest costs are no longer being incurred. Okay, so for each problem you do, you'll have a capitalization period, and you'll need that to do, some of these problems. Now, we have to work with the average. The average accumulated expenditures. Okay, so what are those all about? Your average accumulated expenditures. I'll just show you how it works. When you're incurring costs on a project, if you incurred costs of $200,000 a month for an entire year, then for your average, accumulated expenditures, you could take your total expenditures, divide them by 2 and you get your average, okay? But that's usually not the case. So what we have to do is do a weighted average. So and these are the expenditures we made on the project, okay? We paid the construction contractor this amount, and that amount in different dates. Now obviously we're incurring costs on the $250 all year. We're only incurring interest costs on the second payment from April 1 until the end of the year. And so this is out for 12 months. This is out for 9 months, 4 months, and 1 month. And so you're going to be taking the expenditure times the number of months that it's incurring interest costs, and that gives, when you add it all up, you get the weighted average accumulated expenditures. Okay, fairly straightforward math, but working through a couple of problems will probably be helpful on that. Okay, then we have the bit of the matter of what interest rate to use. Now, it's easy if you are financing the construction, if you've got I'm going to say, if you've got a $3 million project and you got $3 million in financing, that's easy. You just use that interest rate, whatever you're paying on it. It's only when your specific construction financing doesn't cover all the expenditures, all the weighted average accumulated expenditures, that you have to figure out, well, what's your other average rate of borrowing on the company's other debt at that point in time. So you've got a long-term note payable, you've got the 4% 10-year bonds, this gives you the interest rate. So to calculate that, you simply take how much interest you're paying on both of them for the year, divide it by the total amount of the loans, and so your average interest rate that you would use for the sort of rest of the financing is the 6%. This will make more sense when we work through problems. Okay, So that's we use the weighted average interest rate of all the other borrowing for anything that's over and above specific financing. Avoidable interest, you think there's enough terminology here? Avoidable interest is the amount of interest that you could have avoided if you didn't do the thing to begin with, okay? Avoidable interest is the interest that may be capitalized to the cost of the asset, okay? So in this case, we had a weighted average accumulated expenditures. We had specific financing, a construction loan of $1 million. The rate on that was 7%, so that's $70,000. The general financing, where we computed the weighted average interest rate on all our other financing, and it doesn't include this, was 6%, and so the remaining $395 is financed at that rate, and so this is our avoidable interest, which gets capitalized. Okay. All right. So I think that's probably, oh, there's one more step. Sorry, one more step. You have to capitalize whichever is less, the avoidable interest or the actual interest. On some of the problems, the actual interest is actually less. That's a lot of actuals. But usually it's going to be the avoidable interest. So you calculate all your financing, your total interest costs for the year on all your financing, and then if your avoidable interest is less, that's what gets capitalized. And so when we say capitalize, we mean to add it on to the cost of the asset, whatever it is, and then we reduce the interest expense. Okay, so I'm going to work through an exercise on this, and hopefully some of what I just said will start to make sense.